I've always loved hiking. It's my escape, the only time I feel completely at peace with everything around me. But that particular hike, the one that should have been just another weekend trek through the woods, is one I'll never forget. It started like every other hike I've ever done, with me packing my bag, checking my map, and heading out the door. The plan was simple: a 2-day trip through a remote trail in the mountains, somewhere in the backwoods that most people avoided. I'd been on this trail a few times before, but I wanted to challenge myself with a solo hike this time.
No distractions, no noise.
Just me and the wilderness. The day was crisp with that sharp, refreshing air that you only get when you're deep in the mountains. I parked at the trailhead, gathered my gear, and began the climb. The trail was rugged, overgrown in some spots and steep in others, but that's what I liked about it. Felt raw, untouched. There was something comforting about being out there, far from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I hiked for hours, the world around me quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. My boots crunched on the gravel, and I adjusted the weight of my pack. I had a steady pace, taking breaks every now and then, drinking from my water bottle and snapping pictures of the views. The mountains stretched endlessly before me, and it felt good to be so small in such a vast, beautiful place. The first day passed without incident, and I set up camp near a small creek. The fire crackled as I sat beside it, eating some granola and staring at the stars above. The night was peaceful, the kind of silence that wraps you up and makes you feel completely alone in the world. The fire burned low, and eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipping myself in for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. It wasn't fear that kept me up. It was a strange sense of unease, like something wasn't quite right. Every creak of the trees, every snap of a twig in the distance, seemed louder than usual. I told myself it was just the isolation. The woods were always full of sounds, but tonight, those sounds felt different. By the time the sun rose the next morning, I was exhausted. I packed up my gear and started the second leg of the hike, pushing forward even though I still couldn't shake that odd feeling. The trail was more difficult today, winding through thick forest and up steep inclines. The higher I climbed, the more isolated it felt, like the trees were closing in around me. The wind was picking up, and the sky started to cloud over. I knew I'd better make good time if I wanted to reach the summit before dark. Around midday, I came across something strange, a small, half-buried pile of rocks. It was a little off the trail, tucked between a couple of trees. I walked over to inspect it, wondering if it had been left by a hiker, but it looked ancient, the rocks worn and weathered, as though it had been there for a long time. I couldn't make sense of it. There was no clear reason for the pile to be there, just a pile of rocks sitting in the middle of nowhere. I shrugged it off, but something gnawed at the back of my mind. I kept hiking, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that was creeping up on me again. The woods were quieter now, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind brushing through the trees. I was about to take a break when I heard something, a low, sharp crack coming from behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there, just trees. I told myself it was just a branch snapping in the wind, but the sound had been too distinct, too close. I kept walking, trying to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, was growing stronger. The trail started to narrow as I ascended further, and the climb became more treacherous. I reached a part where the rocks were loose, and I had to be extra careful. I was a couple of miles from the summit now, and I knew I had to keep pushing forward. That's when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was brief but unmistakable, a figure darting between the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe another hiker, but the figure hadn't been moving like a human. It was quick, too quick. and there was something off about the way it moved. I waited, frozen, staring into the trees, but nothing else happened. No footsteps, no more movement. The forest was silent again. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light or an animal. Still, the unsettling feeling lingered. I forced myself to continue on the path, but I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't right. Every step felt heavier, every sound more pronounced. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees like a warning, but I pushed on. The summit was so close now, and I was determined to make it. By late afternoon, I finally reached the summit. The view was breathtaking, as it always is when you reach the top of a mountain, but something was off. The sky had turned a dull gray, and the wind was picking up in intensity. I could feel a chill in the air that didn't seem normal for this time of year. I set my pack down and took a few pictures, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I knew I should start heading back down before it got dark, but something kept me rooted there, staring out over the vast expanse of trees below. And that's when I saw it again, a flicker of movement in the forest below, just beyond the ridge. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I could have sworn I saw something moving quickly, darting between the trees, like a shadow that didn't belong. My heart raced again, and I snapped into action. I grabbed my gear and began making my way back down the trail. I had no idea what was out there, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. My pace quickened as I descended, but the forest felt more suffocating now. The trees were taller, denser, and the trail seemed to be twisting in ways I didn't remember. The feeling of being followed was stronger now, pressing in on me. Every crack of a twig, every whisper of wind, made me jump. I knew I had to get back to the trailhead, but the forest was disorienting, and I was starting to feel lost. By the time the sun began to set, I knew I was in trouble. The trail had split in several directions, and none of them seemed familiar. I had no idea which way to go. Panic started to rise in my chest as I pulled out my map and compass, but the darkness was creeping in fast. The wind howled through the trees, and the air grew colder by the minute. I had to make a decision. I couldn't afford to stand still, waiting for the night to swallow me whole. I picked a path that looked familiar, hoping I was heading in the right direction. My legs were aching, and my mind was racing as I hurried through the thickening woods. That's when I heard it again. The crack of something snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Not animal steps, but human-like. Someone or something was following me. I didn't dare look back. I could hear it getting closer, the heavy sound of boots hitting the forest floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed forward, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept getting closer, closer, until I could almost feel the presence behind me, breathing down my neck. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I ran, adrenaline flooding my body. My heart was racing in my chest, and I was terrified that whatever was chasing me was going to catch me. Finally, I broke through the trees, and I saw the familiar sight of the trailhead in the distance. I pushed myself harder, sprinting now, not daring to look back. My legs were burning, my body was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. Not now. When I finally reached my car, I slammed the door shut, panting and trembling. I didn't know what had been following me, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I drove back home, my mind racing, still unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I don't know what happened out there that day, but I'll never forget that hike. I've never gone back to those woods. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there's something out there that doesn't want to be found. Either way, I've learned to respect the forest and the things that might be hiding in it. It was a late autumn morning when I decided to take a solo hike in the woods. The weather had been cool for the past few days, and I figured it was the perfect time to head out. The woods were just a short drive from the small town I lived in, a peaceful place with quiet streets and people who mostly kept to themselves. It was the kind of town that didn't see much traffic or any sort of real excitement. I liked it that way. I parked my car at the trailhead early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen. The air was crisp, sharp even, and it made my breath visible as I took my first steps onto the dirt trail. The trees were shedding their leaves, painting the forest floor with shades of red, orange, and yellow. The leaves crunched underfoot, the only sound breaking the otherwise still morning. I didn't have a set destination. I'd been on this trail before and knew the area well. There were a few well-worn paths that led off the main trail, and I decided I would just follow whichever one felt right. The beauty of hiking alone was that there was no one else to worry about. I could go at my own pace, stop whenever I wanted, and get lost in my thoughts. It was a peaceful sort of solitude that I found comforting. The trail gradually ascended, winding through dense patches of trees. The ground was slightly muddy in places, but nothing I couldn't handle. I had packed light, just a backpack with water, some snacks, a small first aid kit, and a jacket. I wasn't planning on going too far, maybe just a few hours out in the woods to clear my mind. As I walked, I let my mind wander, thinking about work, life in general, and everything that had been going on in my head lately. The rhythm of my footsteps and the occasional bird calls in the distance were soothing. The morning light began to filter through the trees, casting long shadows on the trail and adding a warmth to the cool air. It was one of those perfect autumn mornings where everything just seemed right. I followed the trail as it began to curve around a small hill. It wasn't particularly steep, but it was a noticeable incline. The trees here were denser, and the air felt cooler as I moved deeper into the forest. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by a quiet stillness. It was almost as if the forest had gone silent, waiting for something. I stopped for a moment, taking in the peaceful surroundings. I thought about turning back, but something made me keep going. Maybe it was the quiet, the fact that I was completely alone, or maybe I just wanted to see what lay beyond the next bend. The trail eventually opened up to a small clearing. In the center was a large, weathered rock, the kind that seemed to have been there for ages. The rock was positioned at the top of a small rise, offering a clear view of the surrounding forest. I sat on the rock for a moment, resting and enjoying the view. The morning was still young, and I had plenty of time. As I sat there, I noticed something strange. There was a faint noise, almost like footsteps, coming from the direction I had just come from. It was soft, but definitely there. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up, scanning the trail behind me. The clearing was still empty, but the sound persisted. I listened closely, footsteps slow and deliberate, coming closer. I couldn't see anyone, and the hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up. It was strange. No one else was supposed to be on this trail at this time of morning. I grabbed my backpack and stood still, waiting to see if the sound would get louder or if I would see someone appear. But nothing happened. The footsteps stopped, and the forest fell silent again. I was left standing there, unsure of what I had just heard. Could have been an animal, maybe a deer or something, but it sounded too much like human steps. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. Shaking off the unease, I started walking again, heading back toward the main trail. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, though. It was the strangest sensation, like someone was just out of sight, lurking in the trees, following my every move. I tried to ignore it, but the thought kept creeping into my mind. The trail wound its way through another section of forest, and I found myself starting to hurry my pace. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The morning, once so peaceful, now felt heavy, like the air itself was thick with tension. The footsteps I had heard earlier replayed in my mind, and I couldn't stop thinking about them. Was it just my imagination? Or had someone been on the trail with me, hiding in the shadows? Suddenly, I stopped. Ahead of me, partially obscured by the thick trunks of a few large trees, I saw something strange. It was a figure just barely visible in the distance. Person standing still, facing away from me. They were dressed in dark clothing, and their posture was strange, unnaturally rigid. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the figure, trying to make out more details. The forest around me felt quieter, as if even the birds and the wind had stopped. I couldn't move. I didn't know whether to call out or turn back, but something about the figure felt off. I felt like I was being watched again, but this time it was different. There was a sense of danger, a warning that something was not right. I slowly began to back away, keeping my eyes on the figure. I couldn't take my gaze off of it, even though every instinct in my body was telling me to run. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, almost as if it were waiting for me. I turned around and began walking faster, the pace quickening as I felt the urge to get away from whatever it was. The trail seemed longer now, and the forest felt darker, like the trees themselves were closing in around me. I didn't dare look back, afraid that I would see the figure following me, or worse, right behind me. My breath came faster as I quickened my steps, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The path ahead seemed to stretch on endlessly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. I glanced behind me, but the trail was empty. There was no one there, no figure, just the quiet forest, as if nothing had happened at all. I kept walking, moving as quickly as I could, not caring about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get out of the woods. It wasn't until I reached the clearing again, the large rock where I had rested earlier, that I stopped to catch my breath. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the forest was still. The silence was almost suffocating. The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting warm light through the trees. It was still early, but I didn't care anymore. I needed to leave. I took a deep breath, calming myself down, and began walking back toward the trailhead. The path seemed normal again, just a dirt trail leading through the trees. I could hear birds chirping, the rustling of leaves in the wind. It all seemed so ordinary. I had never been so relieved to see the car parked at the trailhead. When I got back to my car, I quickly locked the doors and sat there for a moment, my heart still racing. What had happened? Who was that figure? Why hadn't they moved? And why did it feel like I was being watched the whole time? I didn't have the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back there. Not anytime soon. The woods had been peaceful once, but now they felt different. Like something in the air had changed. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something I couldn't explain. I had always been the kind of person who sought peace in the outdoors. There was something calming about the wild, about walking through untouched forests, breathing in the cool, crisp air, and hearing nothing but the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. That day, however, would change everything. It started like any other hiking trip, but by the end, I learned more than I ever wanted to know about myself and the wilderness. I had planned the hike for weeks. It wasn't a new trail. I had done it a few times before, and each time I found something new, something that made the trip more enjoyable. The trail started near a small parking lot at the edge of a dense forest, leading up to a mountain that offered a stunning view from the top. It wasn't a difficult hike by any means, but it was long with some challenging stretches, especially as you neared the summit. That morning, I set out early. The sun had just started to rise, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The air was fresh, almost chilly, but I was prepared for the weather. I had my gear, a sturdy backpack with enough water, snacks, a first aid kit, and my trusty walking stick. The first few miles were easy. The path wound through a mix of trees, pine, oak, and birch, and the ground was soft, covered in a blanket of fallen leaves. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots or the distant cry of a hawk. As I continued, I began to notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere. The further I went, the quieter it became. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but soon it became impossible to ignore. The chirping of the birds faded away, and the wind seemed to have died down. The deeper I went, the more unsettling the silence became. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I shrugged it off, focusing on the trail ahead. After all, I had hiked this path before. There was nothing to be afraid of. The trail began to steepen, and I had to use my walking stick more for balance. Sweat beaded on my forehead as the climb got tougher. My legs ached, but I was used to the physical strain. I had come prepared, and I was determined to reach the top. It was around the 4-hour mark when I reached a part of the trail I didn't recognize. The familiar path I had always followed seemed to diverge into two different directions. I stood there, staring at the two options. One path seemed more worn, with obvious footmarks in the dirt, while the other appeared to be less traveled, with ferns and bushes encroaching on the trail. I hesitated. This wasn't right. I had never seen this split before. My instinct told me to turn back, but I didn't want to lose the momentum I had gained. I chose the path to the right, thinking it was the more established route. The further I went, the more the trees closed in around me, and the trail began to narrow. The air grew thicker, heavier, and the feeling of being watched slowly crept in. At this point, I couldn't deny that something felt off. The trees seemed to press in on me from all sides, and there was an oppressive weight in the air. I paused, looking around. The trail behind me was already hidden by the thick brush, and I could barely make out the path I had come from. It was then I noticed something strange, a faint sound in the distance. It was almost like a whisper, but no human voice could be heard. The sound didn't have a clear origin, and it seemed to drift through the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint. I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing, just the wind or some animal rustling in the bushes. But with every step, the feeling of unease grew stronger. As I rounded a bend, I saw something ahead. It wasn't far, maybe 50 yards or so, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. At first, I thought it was a person standing motionless among the trees. But as I took a few more steps, I realized it wasn't. It was an old, weathered cabin. I had never seen this cabin before. It wasn't on any map I had looked at, and I couldn't remember hearing about it from other hikers. The building was small, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the breeze. The wood was aged and covered in moss, and the entire structure looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I approached cautiously, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer to the cabin, the wooden planks of the porch groaning beneath my weight. The door swung open with a loud creak, and I stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, with beams of sunlight streaming through cracks in the walls. The air inside was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Old furniture sat in the corners, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. There were old cans and broken tools scattered across the floor, and the remnants of what looked like a long-forgotten fire pit sat in the center of the room. A strange feeling washed over me, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I couldn't explain why, but I had to leave. I wasn't sure if it was the eerie quiet of the cabin or the feeling of eyes watching me from the shadows, but something deep inside told me I had overstayed my welcome. I backed out slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. At the far end of the cabin, behind a pile of broken furniture, was a small, dusty journal. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to go any closer, but my hand reached for it before I could stop myself. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was faded, but the words were clear enough. It was someone's diary, but it was the last entry that made my blood run cold. Asterisk, they are watching. I can hear them outside. The whispers are getting louder. I don't think I'm alone. Asterisk, the rest of the journal was filled with disjointed entries, ramblings about things that made no sense. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. I quickly shoved the journal back into its place and backed out of the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't waste another second. I turned and ran, my heart racing, not daring to look back. My only focus was the trail ahead, the one that would lead me out of this place. The trees seemed to close in tighter as I moved, and the strange whispers began to echo again, louder this time. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder. After what felt like hours of running, I finally reached the familiar stretch of the trail. The trees opened up, and I could see the clearing ahead, the spot where I had parked my car earlier. The cabin was behind me, hidden in the woods, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot, and when I finally did, I collapsed against the hood of my car, gasping for air. My legs were sore, my body drenched in sweat, but I was safe. I glanced over my shoulder one last time at the trail, half expecting to see something in the distance, but there was nothing. I never went back to that trail, not after what I had seen. I still don't know what happened that day, or why I felt so drawn to that cabin. But I do know one thing. There are parts of the wilderness that should remain untouched, and there are things in the forest that should stay hidden. As I drove away that day, I made a promise to myself. Some places, some trails are best left unexplored. The wilderness had shown me a side of it I wasn't prepared for, but at least I made it out, and that's all that matters. It had started out like any other hike. A simple, calm day in the mountains. The kind of day where you set off with a backpack full of snacks, a good pair of boots, and a sense of adventure that only nature could ignite. I had planned this hike for weeks. A solo trek up a mountain trail I'd heard about from a local guidebook. The route was supposed to be challenging, but not overly difficult. Nothing too extreme, just the kind of climb that made you feel like you'd earned the view from the top. I woke up early, the morning air crisp and cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth inside the cabin where I'd spent the night. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the rocky ground as I made my way to the trailhead. I adjusted the straps on my backpack, checked my water supply, and tightened my boots. With a deep breath, I set off. The path was quiet, too quiet, in fact. It wasn't unusual for there to be little traffic on such a remote trail, but it felt strange. Like the silence was thick, almost heavy. The first few miles were peaceful. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt, the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, and the far-off calls of birds. I didn't think much of it. The weather was perfect, the air crisp, and I felt strong. The trail was a mix of switchbacks and rocky terrain, a steady climb that felt both challenging and satisfying. As I hiked, I took in the scenery. The trees were tall, their trunks thick and covered in moss, their branches reaching up to the sky like outstretched arms. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. By the time I reached the halfway point, I had already stopped twice to catch my breath. I wasn't in bad shape, but the elevation was starting to get to me. The higher I went, the thinner the air felt, and the more my legs burned. But there was no turning back. I had come this far, and the summit was so close. I pushed myself onward, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. The trail grew steeper as I climbed, and the trees started to thin out. The landscape opened up, revealing sweeping views of the valley below. I paused for a moment to take in the beauty. everything from the rocky outcrops to the distant mountains that stretched as far as the eye could see. I pulled out my water bottle, took a long drink, and set off again, eager to reach the summit. It wasn't long after that things began to feel off. The weather, which had been perfect, suddenly started to shift. A cold breeze picked up, biting at my skin. I could feel a drop in temperature, and the once clear skies began to cloud over. At first, I didn't think much of it. Weather in the mountains could change fast, and I had prepared for that. But the shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, and that's what made it unsettling. The trail was starting to get rockier, more challenging. I had to use my hands at some points to scramble up loose stones, and the air had grown noticeably colder. But it wasn't just the weather, it was the sense of something else, something deeper in the air. The silence had returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the peaceful, natural silence I'd experienced earlier. It felt unnatural, like the world around me was holding its breath. And there was a strange feeling, like I was being watched. I shook it off. My mind had a way of playing tricks on me, especially when I was tired. I kept pushing forward, but now I started noticing things that I hadn't before. A strange pattern of tracks in the dirt, too irregular to be animal tracks, yet not human either. I knelt down, inspecting them, but they were too faint to make any sense of. I stood up quickly, brushing off the unease that crept up my spine. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. But the further I went, the more the sense of unease grew. The wind picked up, howling through the trees in sharp gusts, and the temperature continued to drop. The clouds overhead were thickening, swirling like they were being pulled in by some unseen force. I glanced at my watch. It was only late afternoon, but it was getting darker faster than I expected. I stopped to check my map. I had reached the point where the trail split. To the left, the trail continued to the summit. To the right, a smaller, less defined path led downward, toward what looked like a hidden ravine. I had read about this part of the trail. It wasn't heavily trafficked, but it was supposed to offer some of the best views. I decided to take the left path, thinking I'd be at the summit in another hour or so. But as I made my way forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I had been on plenty of hikes before. Long ones, short ones, easy ones, hard ones, but none had ever felt like this. The silence, the strange weather, the odd tracks. It all built up in my mind, layering over each other like a storm waiting to break. The next stretch of trail was rocky, with loose gravel making each step uncertain. My boots slipped a few times as I navigated the sharp incline, and I had to use the jagged rocks to pull myself up. That's when I saw it. A small, crumpled form at the base of a tree. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a pile of branches or some debris blown in by the wind. But as I moved closer, I saw that it was a backpack, torn, dirty, and abandoned. It was half buried under a pile of leaves, the straps frayed and tangled. I crouched down beside it, my heart starting to race. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the fabric. It felt wrong, as if the pack had been there far longer than it should have. I carefully opened it, my fingers trembling. Inside, there were just a few items: snacks, a water bottle, a jacket. Nothing out of the ordinary, but something about the whole scene made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no sign of the person who owned the pack. No footprints leading away from it, no trail of any kind. Just the pack, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. I closed the pack and stood up, my mind racing. I should turn back. This wasn't right. But as I stood there, looking at the pack, I heard something. A noise, faint but distinct, like a low rustling. I turned my head, my eyes scanning the trees. The wind had stopped, and everything felt eerily still. There was no one, no movement, no sign of life anywhere around me. I was alone. I had to leave, fast. I knew I wasn't far from the summit, but the pack, whatever had happened here, was more than enough to convince me to turn back. I turned on my heel and started to retrace my steps, the sense of being watched never leaving me. My heart hammered in my chest as I hurried down the trail, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Then I heard it again, a rustling, closer this time. I whipped around, my pulse pounding in my ears. There was nothing there, just the same trees, the same rocks. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get off the mountain, but I couldn't. I was too far in now. I pushed on, faster now, my feet slipping on the loose rocks. My hands burned as I gripped the sharp edges of the stones. The wind had picked up again, biting at my face, the clouds above swirling in a chaotic mess. The summit was still too far away, and the sense of something following me grew stronger with each step. Finally, I saw it, the trailhead. I was close, so close. I didn't look back, I just ran. When I reached the base of the mountain, I didn't stop. I kept going, not even glancing over my shoulder. The trail had been long, and the journey had been unsettling, but I had made it out. My legs were sore, my heart still racing, but I had survived. I never did find out who left that backpack or what caused that strange feeling. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I had gotten too tired, too focused on finishing the hike. But the silence that followed me down that mountain stayed with me long after I left the trail. In the end, I made it home, safe, and I told myself I'd never let it happen again. Never let my mind get so lost in the woods that I couldn't find my way back. But even now, whenever I look at a trail map, I can't help but wonder, what happened up there? Who was it that left that pack behind? The sun had barely risen that day, the light just starting to push through the tall pines that lined the mountain trail. I had been planning this hike for weeks, but I wasn't prepared for what the day would bring. I didn't expect it to turn into something so nerve-wracking, something that made me question every decision I'd ever made to set foot in the wilderness. I had chosen a trail that wasn't too popular, a quiet one that looped around a small mountain range. The idea was to escape the noise of everyday life, find some peace, and just be alone with nature for a while. I'd done my research, checked the weather forecast, packed the necessary gear, and made sure I had plenty of water and snacks. Everything was set for a nice, tranquil hike. The trail was narrow and winding, just wide enough for me to walk single file. The trees around me stood tall, their branches intertwined like the arms of giants. As I walked, I couldn't help but admire the way the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting shadows on the ground. The air was fresh, cool against my skin, and the only sounds were the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves underfoot. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. I had been hiking for a couple of hours when I came across something unusual. A small wooden marker, slightly hidden among the foliage. It wasn't on the main trail, more like a side path, and the marker was old, its paint chipped and faded. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the narrow trail that stretched out behind the marker. The trail grew steeper and more rugged as I progressed. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees seemed denser, blocking out the sunlight, and the path became more uneven, twisting in directions that seemed to make no sense. At one point, I slipped on a rock and almost lost my footing. The fall would have been bad, but I managed to grab onto a nearby tree and steady myself. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I pushed on. I was determined to finish what I started. It wasn't long before I came across something else, something that made my stomach drop. There, in the middle of the trail, was a small pile of rocks, arranged in a perfect circle. It wasn't a cairn, like the ones you often see marking a path. This looked deliberate, almost like a symbol. I knelt down, inspecting it closely, but there was nothing to explain what it meant. Just a random pile of rocks, sitting there like an eerie little monument in the middle of nowhere. My instincts were starting to scream at me, but I shrugged it off. I was overthinking it. People come out to the mountains to do weird things sometimes, I told myself. I stood up, took a deep breath, and kept walking. But the feeling didn't go away. It lingered in the pit of my stomach, the sense that something wasn't right. It felt as though the air had changed around me, like the forest was watching, waiting. The sounds that had once seemed so soothing now felt oppressive, like every rustling leaf was a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I climbed higher, the terrain grew rockier, the path more difficult to follow. I had to scramble over large boulders and duck under low-hanging branches. The forest was thick now, and it seemed like I had gone far off any established trail. I didn't remember seeing any markers for a while, but I figured I was just distracted by my thoughts. Then I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. It was a strange clearing, though. The trees around it were much larger than the ones I had passed before, their trunks wider and more gnarled, twisted in unnatural ways. The ground was covered in moss, and there was a faint smell of damp earth in the air. I stepped into the clearing and looked around. The silence was deafening. No birds, no wind, nothing. It was as if the entire forest had gone still, holding its breath. I didn't like it. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, I heard it, a soft crack, like something stepping on a twig. I froze, my heart racing. I was sure I was alone. I had been alone for hours, but now it felt like someone or something was out there, just beyond my line of sight, watching me. I turned in a slow circle, trying to see if anyone else was there, but the clearing remained empty. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake it. I needed to get out of there. The trail back to the main path was still a ways off, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I started walking briskly, my steps quick and purposeful. The feeling of being followed persisted, growing stronger as I pushed through the underbrush. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but the sensation of eyes on me was undeniable. I tried to keep my breathing steady, to calm my nerves, but the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening around me. I stumbled over a root, catching myself on a tree, and when I looked up, I realized something had changed. The trees around me seemed off. Their shapes were wrong, as if they had moved while I wasn't paying attention. The trail ahead of me no longer seemed familiar. It was like the forest had rearranged itself, twisting into a maze. Panic surged through me. I wasn't lost, couldn't be lost. I had followed the trail for hours, but now everything was different. My breath quickened, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I forced myself to stop, to think. I had to get my bearings. I couldn't let fear control me. I took a deep breath and tried to remember the way I had come. The trail had been steep, rocky, and winding, but I knew it led back to the main path. I just had to find it. But no matter which way I turned, the trees looked the same. The ground felt uneven beneath my feet, and I couldn't hear anything but the thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, just a flicker of movement, but it was enough to freeze me in place. I turned toward it, my body tense, my mind racing with thoughts of what it could be. But again, there was nothing, just the dense forest, quiet and still. I was losing it. I had to keep my cool. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows through the trees. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could feel the chill in the air. I knew I had to get back to the main trail before it got too dark. The last thing I wanted was to be out here after nightfall. I picked up the pace, my steps becoming more frantic as the darkness closed in. The trail, if it could even be called that, had become almost unrecognizable. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick and tangled, and it was getting harder to move quickly. My legs were burning from the effort, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to stop. That's when I heard it again. The faintest sound of footsteps behind me, just out of reach, too soft to be certain. But I knew I wasn't imagining it this time. I was being followed. I couldn't let myself panic. I needed to focus. I had to get to safety. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as I fought my way through the brush, my breathing shallow, my mind whirling. The darkness was complete now, the last of the light from the setting sun disappearing behind the mountains. I had to keep moving, but I was exhausted, and my legs felt like they were made of lead. And then, just as I thought I might collapse, I saw it. The main trail, a faint, worn path cutting through the trees ahead of me, a sign of civilization in the vast wilderness. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled toward it, my steps uneven but determined. I didn't look back as I hit the main trail and kept walking. I didn't care anymore about the strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched, the eerie silence. I just wanted to get back to where I knew I was safe. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead, where I found my car parked under the trees. It was dark now, the forest behind me quiet again. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. But I was safe, and that was all that mattered. I had been looking forward to the hike for weeks. The plan was simple: head into the mountains for a couple of days of solitude, some fresh air, and a chance to clear my mind. I'd always been drawn to the outdoors, to the trails that twisted through forests and up rocky ridges. It was always a place of peace for me, a retreat from the noise of everyday life. But I had no idea how quickly that peace would turn into something unsettling. It was early morning when I set off. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft orange glow across the horizon. The cool morning air was refreshing, and the scent of pine and earth filled my lungs as I shouldered my pack. I'd done this hike before, but it had been years, and the map I had seemed a bit out of date. Still, it looked easy enough. A straightforward trail that led to a small, secluded lake nestled in the heart of the forest. I didn't expect anything to go wrong. In fact, the first few hours were perfect. The trail was quiet, the kind of peace you only get in places far from civilization. I could hear the sound of birds above, the rustling of leaves underfoot, and the occasional crunch of a twig breaking as I moved through the forest. The trees were tall and dense, and the path wound gently through them, leading me higher into the mountains. But as I continued, the trail started to feel less familiar. The markings on the trees were sparse, and some of the paths seemed to have overgrown with thick brush. It was nothing I couldn't handle, but it started to feel like the trail had changed since the last time I was there. I chalked it up to the fact that nature reclaims everything eventually, and I carried on, more focused on the peace around me than on the little changes in the landscape. By midday, I reached a part of the trail that was particularly steep. The sun was high in the sky now, and the heat made the climb harder than I expected. Sweat dripped down my back as I pulled myself up using the roots of trees and the rough rocks that jutted out from the mountainside. The view was breathtaking, and for a moment, I paused to catch my breath and look out over the valley below. It was so still, so quiet. I felt a sense of accomplishment as I pushed forward, hoping to reach the lake by evening. But then I started noticing something odd. It wasn't the sounds of the forest. Those were still there, although they seemed distant, muffled somehow. What felt strange was the way the forest had changed. The trees, once vibrant and full of life, now seemed to grow in twisted, unnatural shapes. Their trunks were thick and gnarled, their branches reaching out like long, bony fingers. The air felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't quite place. It didn't feel like the peaceful mountain trail I had remembered. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the fatigue of the climb, but the feeling lingered. The path had become increasingly difficult to follow. I stumbled over rocks and roots, my pace slowing as I had to navigate more carefully. The trail had started to disappear altogether, and I found myself pushing through dense underbrush, following the faintest traces of a path. My water was running low, and my stomach grumbled as I thought about the small snacks I had packed. It wasn't a big deal, just a small hiccup. I had been on harder hikes before. But then, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I realized something far more unsettling. I had no idea where I was. I stood still for a moment, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. The trail had completely vanished. There were no markings, no sign of the path I had been following for hours. My heart began to race as I looked around, trying to spot something familiar. But all I could see was a dense wall of trees, their shadows growing longer as the evening approached. I was lost. I checked my map again, but the ink on the page was smudged from the moisture in the air. The contours of the terrain had shifted in a way that didn't match the map. I was no longer on the trail I had started on, and I had no idea how to get back to it. The sinking feeling in my stomach grew deeper. The sun was setting, and I had no choice but to keep moving. The temperature dropped as darkness started to settle in. My breath puffed out in small clouds, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to focus. I had to keep walking. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was no use. Every tree looked the same, every ridge unfamiliar. I stopped a few times to listen for any sign of human presence. Voices, the sound of a distant car, anything. But all I heard was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of an owl. It was completely silent except for nature's sounds. Hours passed. The darkness thickened, and I knew I couldn't keep walking blindly through the forest. I found a small clearing and set up camp for the night. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I used my small flashlight to gather some firewood and made a small campfire. I sat by it, my nerves fraying as I watched the flames flicker and dance. I was cold, exhausted, and scared, but I had to stay calm. I told myself that the morning would bring clarity, that I would find my way out. But as I sat there, trying to focus on the fire, I began to hear something that made my blood run cold. There was a rustling in the bushes. It wasn't the usual sound of animals moving through the forest. It was deliberate, slow, almost calculated. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring into the dark shadows of the trees, waiting for whatever it was to reveal itself. The rustling stopped. For a long moment, there was only the crackling of the fire and the wind. But then I heard it again, a soft, steady crunching sound, like something heavy moving through the underbrush. It was close, too close. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound, but the beam cut through nothing but darkness. There was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? Maybe a person lost like me? But the more I thought about it, the less any of those explanations made sense. The movements were too calculated, too deliberate. Whatever was out there was aware of me. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the shadows. The rustling grew louder, closer, but still no sign of anything in the darkness. My hand gripped the handle of my knife, ready for anything. But the sound stopped, just like that, dead silence. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, but eventually I decided that I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to move. I had to get out of this forest. I grabbed my pack and began walking again, my mind racing. It was impossible to stay on any path now. The woods had become an unrecognizable labyrinth. But I couldn't stay put, and I couldn't let whatever had been watching me find me again. Hours passed, and the air grew colder. I had no idea where I was going, but I kept moving, driven by the desperate need to get out. My legs ached, my head spun, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my pulse racing, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let fear control me. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it, a faint light in the distance, far off but unmistakable. It was the first sign of civilization I had seen in what felt like forever. I stumbled toward it, my legs shaking with exhaustion, and as I drew closer, I realized it was the light of a cabin. Relief flooded over me. I didn't care who was inside. I didn't care about anything except getting to safety. I knocked on the door, breathless and trembling. The door opened to reveal an older man who looked just as surprised as I felt. I don't remember much of what happened next, just that he let me inside, gave me food and water, and listened to my story. In the morning, he showed me the trail out of the forest, the way I should have gone in the first place. When I finally reached the road and saw the familiar sight of my car parked where I had left it, I felt like I had escaped some kind of nightmare. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never take the safety of a well-marked trail for granted again. The day I went on that hike started out like any other. I had been planning the trip for weeks. There's something about the mountains that calls to me, the quiet, the peace, and the physical challenge. I'm no seasoned hiker, but I know my way around a trail. I had packed light, some water, a couple of energy bars, and a jacket just in case. The forecast was clear, the sun shining with no chance of rain. It seemed perfect, the kind of day that makes you feel invincible. I arrived at the trailhead early, the sun still low in the sky, and the air crisp. The lot was nearly empty, only a few cars scattered around. I locked my car, double-checked I had my keys, and set off. The path started easily enough, winding through the lower part of the forest, where the trees still held their full leaves. There's always something about the way the early morning light filters through the canopy that makes the whole world feel peaceful. Birds called in the distance, and the scent of pine was strong in the cool air. It felt like the kind of day you could get lost in the best way possible. I pushed ahead, letting the rhythm of my feet on the dirt keep my mind focused. The first few miles were uneventful. The path was well marked, and the climb wasn't too steep. I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the solitude. It wasn't until I reached a fork in the trail, a little over 2 hours in, that things started to feel off. There were two paths. One continued upwards, narrowing as it snaked toward the ridge. The other cut off to the left and seemed to drop down into a small valley. Both looked well worn, but the signpost was old, half covered with moss, and the labels weren't clear. I hesitated. Normally, I'd trust the more obvious path, but something about the other trail caught my attention. It was quieter somehow, the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy but curious at the same time. My gut told me to take the valley route, so I did. I didn't realize how steep the descent was going to be. The trail narrowed quickly, and the incline increased as I descended into the valley. The trees became denser, and the sunlight dimmed. At first, I didn't mind. I was focused on the path, navigating the rocks and uneven ground. But after a while, the sounds of the forest around me started to fade. The birds stopped calling. It was just me, my breath, and the sound of my boots crunching against the forest floor. I paused for a moment to catch my breath and realized how alone I felt. There wasn't another soul around. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was suffocating. A breeze rustled through the leaves above me, but otherwise, the valley was eerily still. My instincts, honed over years of hiking, told me something wasn't right. I should turn back, but I didn't. There was a stubbornness in me that refused to back down. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, so I pressed forward. The trail twisted and turned through the valley, the trees thickening even more, and the air felt heavier. I checked my watch. It had been almost an hour since I made the turn. I figured I'd go a little farther, then turn back if nothing interesting showed up. Maybe I'd catch a glimpse of a deer or something to calm my nerves. But that never happened. Instead, I noticed something strange, a slight change in the texture of the ground. It was soft, almost sponge-like in some areas, as if the earth had been disturbed. I squatted down and noticed the soil was loose, crumbling in my hands. My heart began to race as I scanned the area more carefully. There was something unnerving about the way the valley seemed to close in around me, as if the trees were watching, keeping me confined. The path continued down, but now I was having second thoughts. I glanced over my shoulder, as if expecting someone to be standing behind me. There was nothing, of course, but the feeling didn't fade. I started walking faster, my footsteps quickening. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but I felt this overwhelming need to get out of the valley. There was an unsettling sense of something following me, even though the forest around me remained still. It was as if the silence itself had grown heavy, pressing down on me with each step I took. I didn't know how long I had been moving when I reached a clearing. It was large, open, with a small creek running through the middle. For a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. The valley had lifted, and I could see the sky again. The sun streamed through the trees, and the sound of water rushing over rocks filled the space. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, but that relief was short-lived. In the center of the clearing was a small, dilapidated cabin. It was barely standing, the roof caved in on one side, and the walls were rotting. But it was the fact that the cabin was there at all that unsettled me. I had been following a marked trail, and yet there was no mention of any cabin in the area. Curiosity won out. I approached it cautiously, each step making the old wood creak. The door hung ajar, and I could see that inside was nothing but dust and decay. There was nothing there. No signs of recent life, no fresh footprints. Just the smell of mildew and the sound of the creek. Still, my skin crawled as I stepped closer. Suddenly, I heard something snap in the woods behind me. A twig, the kind of sharp crack that makes you freeze, and I did. Every muscle in my body tensed. I turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. The air felt too still, too thick. I could hear my own breathing, my heart hammering in my chest. Something wasn't right. I had to get out of there. Without thinking, I started to back away from the cabin, my eyes darting between the woods and the clearing. The ground beneath me was soft, and with each step, I felt like I was sinking deeper. I quickened my pace, heading back toward the trail. The sounds of the forest seemed to intensify now, the wind picking up, the leaves rustling louder. I felt like I was being pursued, though I knew there was no one there. I didn't stop until I found the fork again, the one I had passed hours earlier. The decision I had made to take the valley route now seemed foolish. I had been so sure of myself before, but the doubt was creeping in now, gnawing at me. I turned back to the main path, the one I had ignored earlier, and began to retrace my steps, my movements almost frantic now. The return hike was much harder than I remembered. My legs were sore, the weight of my pack felt heavier, and the trail seemed longer than it had before. But I couldn't stop. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. Just the dense forest, the path, and my own shadow. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, I was exhausted. My breath was ragged, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something dangerous. My car was the only one left in the lot. I fumbled for my keys, trying to calm my shaking hands as I finally unlocked the door. When I climbed inside and started the engine, I realized I hadn't even taken a single picture. Not one. Not of the valley, not of the clearing, not even of the cabin. I don't know why I didn't. Maybe something in my gut told me not to. And as I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but feel that the forest was watching me go. But I was safe, and that's what mattered. The whole hike felt wrong in hindsight. Maybe it was the strange feeling in the valley, or the unsettling silence, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. But I'd learned something that day. Trust your instincts. And sometimes the best hike is the one you never take.